Your God-given identity is established as you wrestle with your purpose on earth to overcome. It's not your gender, money, gifts, or stuff that defines you. Destiny emerges in finding grace to overcome hardships and temptation. Eternal rewards are made here. God is near, even when it doesn't look like it.
Thanks for joining us on Life Journeys, a podcast about thriving through the worst pain that life brings. With global initiatives threatening big changes to our way of life, we're going to need to activate Jesus' words about mountain-moving faith. Words That Work is the ongoing series on Life Journeys that is rooted in releasing revelational words of faith that will work every time and with everyone. It's about moving the mountains that keep us from the presence and goodness of God. It's about defining our life purpose and identity through encountering Him until we have the power to move the obstacles that are destroying our liberty and hope.
This may be one of the most important messages that you will ever hear. Don't waste your life-defining trials. God uses ordinary people who are willing to wrestle with Him until life's hardships have proven them like gold tried in the fire. If you want to know how to stop wasting your trials and let God establish and accomplish your life purpose, then listen to this message. God doesn't call qualified people to ministry or to heaven. He qualifies those that He calls. Jacob would learn this as an unqualified man called to form the nation of Israel. But first, God had to lead him through life's injustices and hardships until he learned to not play the victim card, but trust God to establish His true identity. It's about who God is in us, not who we are, that counts. I think of myself as a young man. I was pretty selfish, angry, and hurting in my insecurity. In other words, I was a perfect candidate for the will of God. He takes people who are a mess and uses them to display His grace and glory, not men's greatness. Your value is established with God because you're willing to wrestle with Him and not give up until He changes you. On the journey, you'll often think that it's impossible, and you're going to live like a hot mess forever. When he found out that God had chosen him over his older brother and firstborn brother Esau, Jacob tried to be the chosen one through deception. He needed to learn how to trust in the mercy and power of God when everything around him was working against him. He further needed to learn that God wasn't against him. He needed to learn that he didn't have to find the right formula for divine success. His blessing was a sovereign choice. It's not a reward for good behavior. Otherwise, people would take the credit for it. Of course, God called me and blessed me. I've been such a good boy. Nope. Jacob would say, I'm not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. It took him 20 years to say that. I looked at a picture of myself when I was young, and I remembered what I was thinking, how I was acting, and what I wanted. And it wasn't godly. At all. Even when I got married and loved my wife, I was still no good. Oh, you surely had some good in you. Yeah, when I wanted to be good and when it served my purposes. Now, I could spend a lot of time here beating my old self to a pulp, but God called me for a purpose. In fact, He did it long before I got saved, but I just didn't know it yet. He has worked on me for nearly 50 years now, and I still have many blemishes and spiritual weaknesses. But the point is, I am called by the grace of God and powered by His glory, not mine. And that's very hard to internalize. It did take Jacob 20 years before he was finally ready to go and be reconciled to his brother and walk into his calling. And even then, he didn't act like he was ready. So Jacob wrestled with God all night long. But he prevailed, the Bible says. He kept wrestling until he broke through to victory with God and in his own soul. And finally, he received his new identity, Israel. He was no longer Jacob. Israel means God prevails. And God prevailed in molding the man into someone whom he could use. And it took a wrestling match. In fact, it takes a man who is willing to wrestle with God all his life, whom God can use. He has flesh that must be crucified daily. He has to stay in a position of ever relying upon God instead of his own cunning, gifts, strengths, and experience. After God changed his name, Israel could say, "My name is God prevails. I have power with God and with men. I rule as God rules. He has prevailed in my life in order that he can prevail through my life." Jacob had learned to do God's will, God's way, not his own, and it took many hardships to get there. He prevailed instead of folding as he wrestled with God over his own carnality. He wouldn't give up the fight concerning his own flesh, but he fought with the angel all night long. To me, it's symbolic of the fights we have in the darkness as we seek to align our souls with God against the many obstacles of fear, temptation, anger, doubt, hurt, and confusion. We're trying to answer the question, why has God allowed this? Those who don't give up when the cross weighs heavy upon them are the ones who prevail, and as a prince they find power with God and with men. Now, remember when Jacob started this journey by being banished from his homeland. Conflict forced him to flee, and it was in the will of God that he do so. Here he had a dream and saw angels ascending and descending on a ladder into heaven. When he awoke, he said what we should know as we begin our arduous journey of being made fit for our calling. Surely God was in this place, and I didn't know it. With all these afflictions, I thought God left me because he was disappointed with me. I didn't know he's been right here all along. God was with Jacob, though it certainly didn't seem like it. But he needed to know that conflict, separation, and injustice against him didn't mean he was out of God's will. Remember, when you make poor decisions and it affects your life greatly, you are still in the center of God's will, for he will establish the perfect pathway ahead to bring you exactly where you need to be in this life and the next. So, wrestle with God through the darkness until you've prevailed and broke through all the things that God was dealing with. Wrestle with him by saying, I won't let you go until your word becomes real in my life and blesses me. You have to learn to be content with God's ways and words, no matter what the situation. You have to be a man of the word of the Lord, not the word of your own ways. As long as we live with the drive to be a self-made man instead of a God-made man, we will have a wrestling match with God that seems unending. But when it's over, God will have changed your name. It means that God has changed you and made you the perfect glove in which he will slip his hand, and you'll be able to say, God has prevailed in my life, that he may be able to prevail through my life. You can't fake it. It'll take as long as it takes. Lester Summerall was 75 before God told him, you're finally at the place where I can trust you. Think long and hard about that, for Lester was a man of amazing success in his ministry for decades before that. But remember, do what you do by the word of the Lord, not your own reasoning and condemnation and unbelief. God doesn't need your help, only your willingness to prevail at no matter what the cost. Listen, it's not easy to make a man of God like Israel whose heritage would exist and prevail literally throughout millenniums. But just look at the result of Jacob's wrestling. Jordan Peterson said that this kind of wrestling is true worship. It's not letting go of God, not willing to compromise, and fighting your way through the pain of total honesty, humility, and faith. Faith takes great surrender. Jacob had to learn to trust God when life was being very unfair. That was the key here. Every time his uncle Laban cheated him to destroy his flocks, Jacob just kept his mouth shut instead of whining like a baby about how unfair life was to him. He just trusted God, and every hardship in his life was turned into a blessing until he became a great man. His whole life said, stop manipulating. Don't play the victim card. Trust God and he will bless you. Now, God is saying, do this and I will give you a new name, a name that no one else will know except you and I. Now, you understand this verse from the book of Revelation as Jesus speaks to his churches. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. To him that overcomes, I will give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knows, saving he that receives it. Think of it. God will give you hidden manna, hidden revelation, just for you. You'll have power by your steadfast patience in overcoming, and by it, you will know who you are and why you're in the earth, and you can never have that robbed. Now listen carefully. Learn to overcome the deception in you so that you will be able to overcome the deception against you. America hasn't learned that. You learn it, and you'll be capable otherwise of being deceived until you learn not to deceive yourself and others. Learn to live by faith, for the power of human abilities is the root of deception. Look at Israel today. They exist even after Jacob and Joseph's great trials. They exist after Egyptian bondage for centuries. They exist after dying in the wilderness over a 40-year time span. They exist after centuries of sin, Babylonian captivity, Roman overthrow, the Holocaust, and today being surrounded by nations who want them annihilated. They still exist because there is a God who said they will. Israel's existence through all this speaks to you and I today. God chose you, and nothing can stop his favor from completing what he has begun in you. Nothing. As long as you choose to persist and wrestle with the Lord until your flesh has been tamed by faith.
You can unlock the presence of God in your life. There are revelation principles that remove the mountains, keeping us from joy, hope, peace, and purpose when our world gets turned upside down. Look for these words that work with Pastor Hardica as he shares what has helped him when life got hard. And don't forget to check out his book, The Fortress and the Firebrand, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Thanks for listening to Life Journeys. Find new episodes every Wednesday and Saturday. And if you're new to this series, it begins with the September 16th episode.
Your God-given identity is established as you wrestle with your purpose on earth to overcome. It's not your gender, money, gifts, or stuff that defines you. Destiny emerges in finding grace to overcome hardships and temptation. Eternal rewards are made here. God is near, even when it doesn't look like it.